Welcome to Beyond the Crime. I'm so glad you're joining us
Me too.
for our very first deep dive.
Right into the heart of real-life crime.
Yeah. And today, we're headed to Rochester, New York.
Back in 2018,
We try to figure out what really happened to Sierra Grimes.
an 18-year-old who was tragically shot and killed.
And we've got witness statements,
Police interviews.
even security footage.
Can we put all these puzzle pieces together?
To get the full picture of what happened that night, I don't know.
That's the mission of this deep dive, right?
Exactly.
To go beyond the headlines.
And really dig into the human story behind this crime.
The city, the relationship.
The consequences.
And connect us.
So first, imagine you're in Rochester, New York.
Known for its festivals, its parks.
Beautiful place, really.
But there's another side to the city, too.
One that's struggling with poverty and crime.
And that's the side we're going to be focusing on today.
Yeah, on May 9th, 2018.
That darkness kind of descended on a street called Delamain Drive.
There's a frantic 911 call.
A young woman found shot.
And the whole neighborhood was just on edge.
And everything centered around this one house.
The so-called nuisance house.
Yeah, the neighbors had all sorts of stories about it.
Disturbances, possible drug activity.
The police knew this address.
Which makes the whole thing
Even more complicated.
absolutely.
I mean, you could just feel the tension, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Especially when you add in the blood found on the porch.
And then the SWAT team standoff.
It's like something out of a movie.
But amidst all that chaos...
There was one piece of evidence that emerged
security footage.
from a house across the street
And that footage really throws a wrench.
into the stories we hear from the first few witnesses.
Like Haley Winters, she claims she found Sierra collapsed.
But her story keeps changing.
The clothes she was wearing didn't match the weather.
The number of people she said were there kept changing too.
The detectives knew something wasn't adding up.
Then there's Deshaun S.,
Another friend who was found nearby.
and his account is just as shaky.
He says he went to a store to get candy.
But he can't name the store.
Or show anyone the candy.
It's just a whole web of inconsistencies.
But the security footage gave the investigators a huge clue.
Yeah, it showed Sierra actually being carried out of the house.
Which totally contradicted what the witnesses were saying.
And while the video helped identify some of the people involved,
Well, there's one person who remains unidentified.
a shadowy figure.
Someone who becomes a key part of the investigation.
But before we get too deep into that mystery,
I think we need to understand Sierra a bit better.
absolutely, we can't forget that this is someone's life we're talking about.
Yeah, Sierra was just days away from graduation.
She was passionate about cosmetology.
Full of dreams.
She loved music and dance, had a contagious laugh.
She was full of life.
But her life was also touched by darkness.
In the form of her relationship with Jermaine Brown.
Her on-again, off-again boyfriend
What started out as a typical teenage romance.
turned into something much more sinister.
As they got older.
Jermaine's behavior escalated.
Criminal activity.
Violence.
Control, manipulation.
Sierra was trapped in this cycle of abuse.
That just kept getting more dangerous.
The details her family shared are chilling.
There was one incident where Jermaine made Sierra wear a hat.
To hide injuries that he had inflicted.
Another time, he assaulted her with a 2x4.
It's just a horrifying picture of this young woman.
Desperately trying to escape this toxic relationship.
And just days before her death,
Sierra did something incredibly brave.
she got an order of protection against Jermaine.
But the tragic irony here,
Is that she may have actually broken that order.
to see him on the very night of the shooting,
Yeah, that possibility adds a whole other layer.
to their relationship, to Sierra's state of mind,
It reminds us that leaving an abusive relationship.
is rarely simple or straightforward.
So we got these relationships,
The history of abuse.
and this young woman caught in the middle.
As the investigation unfolded,
Sierra's family immediately suspected Jermaine.
they knew him, they had seen the warning signs.
And the police records confirmed his history of abuse.
But getting someone to talk
To break that code of silence,
was a huge challenge.
remember Haley, our unreliable narrator.
The detectives decided to try a risky tactic,
They didn't tell her that Sierra had actually died.
hoping to get her to tell the truth.
It was a morally complex strategy.
But it did get results.
When Haley finally found out that Sierra was gone
She broke down.
and revealed the missing piece of the puzzle.
Jermaine and the gun. Through Haley's account, clouded with grief and guilt, we're taken back to that night,
Right back to the nuisance house.
where Jermaine was playing with a gun.
He thought it was unloaded.
And then a single shot rings out.
You could just feel the panic, the scramble to cover up this horrible accident,
He moved Sierra's body.
which made the investigation even more complicated.
But the big question is, was it really an accident?
Or was there something more going on?
That line between recklessness and intent,
It could be pretty blurry.
especially with the Germain's history of violence,
The manslaughter charge against him.
sparked so much outrage.
From Sierra's family, from the community.
They felt like it was a huge injustice.
It didn't take into account the pattern of abuse.
That ultimately led to her death.
It felt like a slap on the wrist.
How can you call it reckless?
When there's a history of brutal assaults,
Sierra's family argued that even if it was unintentional,
the shooting came from a place of aggression.
they believed a murder charge would have been more appropriate.
But the DA said proving intent would be really difficult,
Based on the witness statements,
which all pointed to an accident.
it really makes you question the legal system, doesn't it?
How do we define intent?
When the line between recklessness and malice,
Is so hard to see.
and to add fuel to the fire.
No charges were brought against the other witnesses,
Who were there that night?
including Germain's own sisters,
It brought up this debate about the no snitching culture.
where loyalty and fear overshadow doing the right thing.
It makes you wonder about the responsibility of the bystanders.
Could they have stepped in?
Could their actions have saved Sierra?
Their silence, even if it came from fear,
Had devastating consequences.
it shows us that inaction,
Can be just as harmful as action.
the lack of consequences for the witnesses,
Amplified that sense of injustice.
and there's Germain,
Who pled guilty to manslaughter.
but he didn't really show much remorse.
His demeanor during the proceedings
The lack of emotion.
was really hard for Sierra's family to see.
It just made their pain deeper.
And then the sentencing came.
2 to 6 years.
A sentence that just didn't feel like enough.
For a young life stolen,
The family's disappointment was obvious.
they had hoped for a longer sentence.
One that would deter future violence,
But the reality is,
even with the maximum sentence.
Germain would eventually be free,
He would go back into society
and the family
and the community.
would be left with this fear of what he might do.
Because this wasn't just an abstract fear
Germain had a history.
of criminal activity and violence.
That made it hard to believe.
That this tragic incident would be his last.
It raises this question of how we deal with repeat offenders
Especially those who have a history of violence.
and don't seem to feel remorse.
But even in the face of this injustice,
There's a glimmer of hope
in Sierra's family's determination,
to turn their tragedy into a force for good
they chose to honor Sierra's memory
by speaking out against domestic violence.
and urging others to see the warning signs,
They shared her story,
not just to keep her spirit alive,
but to help others break free from abusive relationships
and create a community that supports victims.
and holds abusers accountable.
It's a reminder of the strength of the human spirit.
The ability to find meaning.
Even in the darkest of times.
Their courage is both inspiring and heartbreaking.
But it also raises the question,
How can we as a society move beyond just reacting to domestic violence?
and actually work to prevent it?
That's the real challenge, isn't it?
We can analyze the crime,
Both through the legal processes,
but the real work
lies in understanding the root causes
of domestic violence.
and figuring out how to break the cycle. So we've been talking about Sierra's case,
But her story is part of a much bigger problem.
domestic violence.
It's a pattern of behavior
that can escalate
from small things.
to really dangerous situations.
It often happens gradually,
The abuser starts with emotional manipulation.
isolating the victim from their friends and family,
Then it moves on to verbal abuse.
and then physical violence,
It's like slowly turning up the heat.
until it boils over.
And by then, the victim might not even realize how dangerous it is.
They blame themselves,
They make excuses.
hoping things will get better.
And leaving that kind of relationship,
Is a whole other challenge.
there's the fear of what the abuser might do,
The financial dependence.
the emotional connection.
It's like a web that's hard to break free from.
Plus, there's the stigma.
People are ashamed or embarrassed to talk about it,
They're afraid of being judged
or not believe.
or even blamed.
It's a silent epidemic.
That affects people from every background.
Sierra's story reminds us
That it can happen to anyone.
that's why we need to be aware,
Learn the warning sign
know how to intervene.
and encourage victims to get help.
Because getting help early can make all the difference.
It's about creating a culture where we talk about these things
Where victims feel safe coming forward,
and where bystanders feel empowered to act.
we need to provide resources and support.
Hotlines, shelters, counseling services.
Those are lifelines.
But we also need to educate ourselves,
Understand how domestic violence works,
learn how to spot the warning signs.
and know what to do if we see something.
Knowledge is power.
And it can save lives.
Sierra's legacy lives on.
through her family's work.
to raise awareness and create a world without domestic violence.
Their work shows us
That even after tragedy,
there's hope for change.
this deep dive into Sierra's story,
Has been about uncovering the truth
facing some uncomfortable realities,
and looking at how the justice system works.
but most importantly,
It's a call to action,
it's a challenge for all of us
to be more than just bystanders.
to be informed, vigilant, and advocates for change.
Because ending domestic violence,
Takes all of us,
it means breaking the silence
providing support.
and creating a safe and supportive society.
So, as we wrap up this episode,
Take a moment to think about what we've learned,
we've explored a crime
the human stories behind it.
and the systems that failed to prevent it,
But we've also seen the incredible resilience
of a family and a community.
determined to make a difference.
Remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
There are resources available, and there's always hope.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and stay compassionate.
Thanks for joining us on this first deep dive of Beyond the Crime.
We hope it's made you curious
Challenge some of your assumptions,
and left you wanting to learn more.
and maybe even make a difference.